You look beautiful tonight.
Thank you, you are very handsome.
I want you close to me.
I want that too.
She was hired to disappear into the wallpaper of a dead man's empire. Instead, she became the only person standing between Kang Min-jae and the truth that would burn his entire bloodline to the ground. Seoul, they said, never slept. Kang Min-jae never bothered to check. He simply assumed the city stayed awake out of fear of disappointing him. At 41 floors above the Han River, his office had the temperature of a morgue and roughly the same warmth. Glass walls, black marble, a single orchid that the cleaning staff had standing orders to replace the instant it showed weakness, much like everyone else in his employ. Min-jae did not tolerate wilting. He was reviewing shipping manifests when his assistant cleared his throat the way men do when they're about to say something that will get them fired. The new maid started today, sir. For the East Wing. I don't manage staffing, Min-jae said, not looking up. No, sir. I just thought you'd want to know the assistant hesitated, recalibrated, chose the coward's path. Settling in well. What he didn't say was, she's the strangest hire human resources has made in a decade, and nobody can explain why she insisted on a 6-month probation period with no pay increase, like she's daring someone to fire her. 3 floors down, in the marble river of hallways that made up the Kang estate, Amara was learning the architecture of contempt. It had its own dialect. The head housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Yoon with the posture of a drill sergeant and the smile of a tax auditor, assigned her the wing with the worst plumbing and the longest hours, then stood back to watch her fold under it. Amara did not fold. She organized her cleaning cart with the precision of a field surgeon and moved through the estate like she already had its floor plan memorized, which, as it happened, she did, because she'd studied the blueprints for 6 weeks before applying for the job. You're quiet, sniffed one of the younger maids, a girl named Sujin who treated gossip as a competitive sport. Is it true where you're from, you didn't have running water? Where I'm from, Amara said pleasantly, wringing out a cloth with the calm of a woman who'd once talked her way out of a Lego safehouse surrounded by armed men. We had running water and the good sense not to ask strangers personal questions before lunch. Sujin didn't have a comeback for that. Few people did, once they tried Amara. What none of them clocked, not Sujin, not Mrs. Yoon, not the security detail who waved her through metal detectors twice a day without a second glance, was that the woman pushing their cleaning cart had spent the last 4 years being hunted by men with considerably worse manners than a Seoul mansion's domestic staff. Her father, Elias Brantose, had built Solen Group from a single forensic accounting contract into a private intelligence network so thorough it made certain national agencies nervous to share a continent with him. He didn't chase criminals for headlines. He chased the paperwork, the wire transfers, the shell companies, the politicians whose vacation homes cost more than their salaries could explain in 9 lifetimes. He called it following the only thing that never lies. Money, unlike men, didn't know how to perform innocence. 4 years ago, his boat went down off the coast of Busan. Officially, engine failure. Unofficially, Amara had memorized every name on the drive he'd mailed her 2 days before he vanished, along with 4 words that had become her entire personality: trust no one's kindness. She'd spent the years since learning that the safest place to hide a needle was inside a haystack nobody respected enough to search. A maid's uniform did more for her cover than any disguise money could buy. People who think you're beneath them rarely bother watching what your hands are doing. So she watched. She catalogued. She learned which guests arrived through the service entrance instead of the front gate, a detail that told her more about the Kang organization's real hierarchy than any annual report could. And she watched Kang Min-jae specifically, the way you'd watch a controlled detonation from what you hoped was a safe distance, close enough to chart the blast radius, far enough not to become part of it. He moved through his own home like a man auditing a hostile takeover, suspicious of every room, including the ones he owned. She'd read his file before she ever wore the uniform. 20 years building an empire on his father's foundation of fear. 0 documented instances of trust. The kind of man who'd interrogate a bouquet of flowers for ulterior motives. He had no idea, not yet, that the quietest person in his house was the only one in it who'd already decided exactly how this would end. 3 floors up, Min-jae set down the shipping manifest and frowned at a discrepancy in the numbers that he couldn't quite name, the way you frown at a word on the tip of your tongue. Somewhere in his empire, the math had stopped adding up. He just didn't know yet that the woman who'd notice it first was currently scrubbing his guest bathroom and memorizing the names on his appointment calendar. 3 months is long enough to learn a man's worst habits, and Amara had learned all of Kang Min-jae's. He drank his coffee black and resentful, like he suspected Sugar of conspiring against him. He reviewed security footage twice a day, not because he expected to find anything, but because trust, to him, was simply a threat he hadn't identified yet. And every Tuesday, his second-in-command Han Tae-sik arrived for a private meeting that ran exactly 40 minutes too long for the agenda it was supposedly covering. Amara had started timing it. 40 minutes was a lot of unaccounted time for a man whose official job was loyalty. She didn't have proof yet. She had instinct, and a drive full of her father's old files, and a growing list of names that kept circling back to people who orbited entirely too close to Min-jae for comfort. Patience, her father used to say, was the only weapon the powerful couldn't outbudget. They could buy guns. They could buy silence. They could not buy the kind of waiting a hunted woman had perfected. What she hadn't anticipated was a shareholders' dinner detonating Min-jae's careful empire into headlines. The Choi Syndicate's representatives had arrived smiling, which should have been the first warning. They raised toasts to continued partnership while dropping numbers into casual conversation that no outsider should have known: shipping routes, quarterly margins, the precise figure Min-jae had quietly diverted into a contingency fund 18 months earlier. Each fact landed like a slap dressed up as small talk. By dessert, half the room understood what was happening. Someone inside Kang's organization had been feeding Choi a steady diet of intelligence, and the leak was sophisticated enough to make Min-jae look like a man who'd lost control of his own house. He smiled through all of it, the particular smile of a man mentally drafting funeral arrangements for whoever was responsible. He needed to seize the narrative back before the story calcified into Kang Min-jae, declining empire. Something theatrical enough that no one would dare laugh at him without looking foolish themselves. What he announced, 3 days later, stunned the country. "I'm getting married," he told the press gathered outside the estate, flat as a man announcing quarterly earnings. "To a member of my household staff." The silence afterward had texture. His family treated it as a declaration of war on the bloodline. His grandmother, a woman who measured worth in hanbok silk and ancestral approval, didn't speak to him for a week, which Min-jae privately considered the most peaceful 7 days of the year. Tabloids ran the story under headlines ranging from mockery to masterstroke, depending on which rival paid for the column. Choi's people laughed loudest of all, which was, of course, the entire point. Let them laugh at a marriage. It was harder to laugh at a man once you realized he'd weaponized humiliation before you could use it against him. Amara received the news the way she received most things that were supposed to break her, with the calm of someone who'd already survived worse on a different continent. "You don't have to do this," Min-jae told her, in the closest thing to courtesy he'd managed since she'd started working for him. It wasn't kindness. It was logistics, a man checking whether his tool would hold under load before he used it. "Refuse, and I'll arrange a transfer. Different staff, different house. No consequences. And if I say yes? Then you're my wife in name, mine to use as a message to people who think I've gone soft. Nothing more." He studied her, waiting for the fear he assumed was coming. Most people would be frightened by that arrangement. Most people, Amara said, haven't already lost everything that scared them into staying quiet. She didn't elaborate, and he didn't ask. That, too, would come back to matter later. The wedding itself was a masterpiece of contradiction, opulent enough to silence critics, brief enough to insult them. Amara wore white because tradition demanded it, not because anyone in the room believed in the symbolism. She signed the marriage certificate with a small, unreadable smile that unsettled the photographers more than tears would have. Here's a question worth sitting with. Before we go further, how many people in your own life have underestimated you the moment they decided you had nothing left to lose? It's a particular kind of mistake, assuming a person's silence means surrender, instead of strategy. Drop your answer below. I'd genuinely like to know how many of you have been the quiet one everyone wrote off too early. The reception lasted 90 minutes. Min-jae's mother left after 40, which he also considered a win. That night, alone in the East Wing's guest suite that was now, technically, the mistress's chambers, Amara opened her father's drive for the 100th time and stared at a name she'd flagged weeks earlier, a name that appeared on a Kang family donor list, and also, disturbingly, in a financial trail her father had been chasing the year he disappeared. She had married into the house with the answer already sitting in her lap. She just hadn't realized yet that the truth went deeper than the husband she'd married for cover. It went all the way to the man who'd raised him. Marriage, Amara discovered, changed almost nothing about her daily life except her title and the size of her closet. She still cleaned. Min-jae insisted she keep occupied rather than idle, which she suspected was less about productivity and more about his discomfort with a wife who had no defined function in his carefully ledgered world. She didn't object. A working wife had reasons to be in every room of the house, and reasons were currency. What marriage did change was access. As staff, she'd been invisible. As Mrs. Kang, she was invisible and permitted in rooms staff weren't, which made her, functionally, the most dangerous kind of furniture, the kind that could open doors. She used that access on a Tuesday. Han Tae-sik arrived at 2 p.m. sharp, as he always did, carrying a leather folio he held like a man cradling something fragile, which was either devotion to detail or guilt dressed up as professionalism. Amara had learned to read the difference. This was guilt. The meeting was scheduled for 40 minutes. It ran 53. Amara, polishing a banister that did not need polishing, timed it on a watch her father had given her, the one possession from her old life she still wore, because some habits were closer to prayer than sentiment. When Tae-sik left, he didn't look at her. People who are hiding something rarely look at the furniture, it's the looking away that gives them shape. That night, she did what she'd done methodically for 3 months, she cross-referenced. Her father's old files held a partial financial trail, a shell company registered in Macau, funneling irregular sums through what looked, on paper, like a legitimate logistics subsidiary. She'd assumed, originally, it belonged to Choi's syndicate. Rival money, doing what rival money does. But the routing numbers didn't match Choi. They matched an account she'd seen, just once, on a wire authorization Tae-sik had left open on a tablet in the study, an account with Kang Group's own internal signature embedded in the metadata, buried 3 encryption layers deep, the kind of detail a careless man leaves behind when he's confident no one in the house is smart enough to look. Tae-sik wasn't selling secrets to Choi out of ambition. He was laundering something, moving money out of Kang's own empire, dressing it up as competitor espionage so that when it was eventually discovered, all eyes would land on rival sabotage instead of internal rot. It was, Amara had to admit, almost elegant. Like a magician's misdirection, except the trick wasn't the disappearing coin. It was the audience never realizing whose pocket it landed in. She brought none of this to Min-jae. Not yet. A man who'd built his life on control did not respond well to incomplete information. He'd want certainty, and certainty required one more piece she didn't have, who Tae-sik was protecting. Because a man that careful wasn't freelancing. He was following someone else's choreography. She found her answer 3 days later, in a place she hadn't thought to look, the family photo archive in Min-jae's late father's study, a room Min-jae visited so rarely it had its own film of dust, like even the air respected the boundary of his grief. Buried in a folding ledger tucked behind a row of photographs was a donor record from 22 years prior, a contribution to a maritime consulting firm, signed by Kang Min-jae's father, in the same year, the same month. That a private security executive named Elias Brantose had been investigating maritime fraud routes through the Korea Strait. Her father's name. In her father-in-law's handwriting. Amara sat very still in that dusty study, the way you sit still after a car accident, when your body knows something has changed before your mind has caught up. The drive in her possession had always pointed towards someone connected to her father's disappearance. She had simply never let herself consider that the someone might be sleeping 6 feet under, technically, in the family plot she now, by marriage, had every right to visit. She closed the ledger. She did not cry. Crying was for people with the luxury of being surprised. Downstairs, Min-jae was reviewing the same shipping discrepancy that had been needling him for weeks, the math that refused to add up no matter how many times his accountants reassured him it was a rounding error. He didn't believe in rounding errors. He believed numbers were honest even when people weren't. He found his wife in the hallway outside his father's study, composed, dry-eyed, holding nothing in her hands that betrayed what she'd just learned. "You've been in there," he said. Not a question. He'd installed motion sensors in every room of this house, including the ones he pretended not to monitor. "Dusting," Amara said. He studied her the way he studied a manifest that didn't balance, aware something was off, unable yet to name the missing line item. "My wife," he said slowly, testing the word like it might be a trap, "doesn't strike me as a woman who dusts for sentiment." No, Amara agreed, and for the first time since the wedding, something almost like respect passed between them, two people who recognized, in each other, a fellow liar with excellent technique. "I don't." He let it go. He had a leak to find, after all, and a wife was, at most, a complication he hadn't budgeted for. He had no idea she'd just found the leak's source, and that the trail led straight to the man whose photograph hung at the head of the family wall. Min-jae had built his entire life on the conviction that numbers were the one language incapable of betrayal. People lied. Spreadsheets, properly audited, did not. Which was why the discrepancy in the shipping manifests had been eating at him for 6 weeks like a splinter his body refused to push out. Small. Persistent. 3% variance on container weights across the Busan-Incheon corridor, nothing a casual inspector would flag, everything a man raised to distrust convenient explanations would notice. He'd assigned the audit to Tae-sik personally. Tae-sik had returned it clean. Rounding errors. Customs reclassification. Nothing to concern yourself with, sir. Min-jae did not believe in nothing. He pulled the raw data himself that night, alone in his office, the city's lights smeared gold across the glass like something out of a painting he'd never admit to finding beautiful. He cross-referenced shipping weights against fuel costs against insurance claims, building the picture his second-in-command had apparently hoped he'd never bother to build. The pattern, once visible, was almost insulting in its simplicity. Containers logged as damaged in transit, write-offs, losses absorbed by Kang Group's own insurance, were, according to Port Authority records he'd had to bribe a customs clerk to access, arriving fully intact and being rerouted through a secondary logistics chain that didn't officially exist on any Kang Group ledger. Someone was stealing from him in plain sight, dressed up as bad luck. He thought, briefly, of every time he'd dismissed Amara scrubbing a floor near his study door, and felt the particular irritation of a man realizing the most observant person in his house had been the one he'd paid least attention to. He found her in the kitchen, alone, at an hour when the rest of the staff had gone to bed. She was reading, actually reading, a worn paperback with a cracked spine, the kind of object that told him more about her than 3 months of marriage had. "You've been watching Tae-sik," he said. No preamble. He'd never been a man for preamble. Amara closed her book. "Have I?" "Don't." His voice had an edge she hadn't heard before, not threat, exactly. Closer to exhaustion wearing threat's clothing. "I've spent 6 weeks finding what you apparently already know. Don't waste what's left of my patience pretending otherwise." She considered him for a long moment, the kind of assessment she usually reserved for documents, not husbands. "What do you think you found?" "Theft." Rerouted cargo. A shadow chain my own logistics director somehow never noticed. That's the embezzlement, she said. It's not the betrayal. The distinction landed harder than she'd intended. Min-jae sat, slowly, across from her, the posture of a man whose certainty was being dismantled one sentence at a time and didn't yet know how he felt about the demolition crew being his wife. Then enlighten me, he said. Since apparently my own house has been running a parallel intelligence operation under my nose. So she told him, not everything, not yet, but enough. The shell company in Macau. The wire authorization with Kang Group's embedded signature. The 40-minute Tuesdays that ran 53. She watched him absorb it the way he absorbed bad news at the negotiating table, stillness first, calculation second, fury reserved for later, when it could be useful. Tae-sik, he said. Not a question. Tae-sik is the hand, Amara said carefully. I don't yet know whose arm it's attached to. This is, if you're keeping score, usually the part of the story where the audience starts asking the obvious question, who do you think is really pulling the strings here? If you've been paying attention to the small details, you probably already have a theory. Comment yours below before the next chapter confirms or wrecks it. Min-jae stood, paced, stopped at the window the way men do when they need the city to witness their composure cracking in private. You've had this information for weeks. Why tell me now? Because tonight you found the money, Amara said. And a man like you doesn't stop chasing money. You'd have pulled this thread eventually, with or without me. I'd rather control how it unravels than watch you set off a bomb by accident. It was, he realized with some discomfort, the most honest sentence anyone in his organization had said to him in years, and it had come from the one person he'd married specifically because he assumed she had nothing to say at all. What do you need, he asked, to finish pulling the thread? Time. And you not confronting Tae-sik until I tell you to. She met his eyes, steady as a closing argument. He's not improvising, Min-jae. Whoever's running him will burn the whole operation down rather than let it be traced back to its source. The moment he feels cornered, this stops being about money. Min-jae didn't ask how she knew that with such certainty. He was beginning to understand that his wife's certainty was not a guess. Fine, he said. You have your time. What neither of them said, what hung in the kitchen's fluorescent quiet like a held breath, was that the clock had already started, and somewhere in the house, Han Tae-sik had noticed the new light burning in Min-jae's study at 1 a.m., and was making calculations of his own. Han Tae-sik had survived 3 years inside Kang Min-jae's organization by following one rule above all others: never be in the room when the math stops adding up. He broke that rule on a Thursday, and he knew at the moment he saw Min-jae's face. It wasn't fury. Min-jae's fury, Tae-sik had seen before, cold, surgical, the kind that ended careers without raising its voice. This was different. This was a man who'd already done the arithmetic and was simply waiting to see if Tae-sik would have the dignity to confirm it himself. The Macau account, Min-jae said, sliding a single printed page across the desk. No ceremony. No interrogation room theatrics. Just numbers, the language that didn't lie. Walk me through it. Tae-sik's folio sat untouched in his lap. 3 years of careful Tuesdays, of misdirection dressed as loyalty, collapsing under the weight of a piece of paper. I can explain, he started, and even he heard how thin it sounded. You can, Min-jae agreed. Whether I believe it is a separate matter. What Tae-sik didn't know, what he'd spent 3 years successfully not knowing, because not knowing was safer, was who he'd actually been protecting. He'd told himself it was business. A percentage skimmed, a debt repaid to people who didn't accept no as a complete sentence. He hadn't asked too many questions about why the original arrangement existed, because the man who'd recruited him into it had a way of making questions feel like a terminal diagnosis. That man was watching this exact conversation unfold through a security feed Tae-sik didn't know existed, a backdoor installed years ago by someone with intimate, generational access to the Kang estate's infrastructure. Someone who'd had the blueprints since before Min-jae was old enough to walk. When Tae-sik's hesitation stretched a second too long, that someone made a decision. The first sign of trouble was the power flickering, once deliberate, a system reset disguised as an outage. Then the estate's exterior cameras, all 14 of them, went dark in sequence, like a row of dominoes designed by a man who'd had years to practice the choreography. Amara felt it before she understood it. She'd spent 4 years learning the specific silence that precedes violence, the way a room's pressure changes right before it breaks. She was in the East Wing when the lights cut, and she didn't waste time wondering why. She moved. Min-jae. Her voice through the house intercom was flat, urgent, devoid of the performance she'd spent months perfecting for everyone else's benefit. Get away from the windows. Now. He didn't ask questions. That, too, surprised her, a man who questioned everything, choosing in the one moment that mattered to simply trust the instruction. Tae-sik, to his eventual and fatal credit, understood faster than anyone what the blackout meant. "They're not here for me," he said, standing so fast his chair toppled. "They're cleaning the room. Witnesses included. Choi's people or his own?" Min-jae thought, and then realized, with the particular vertigo of a man whose entire worldview was rearranging itself in real time, that the distinction might not matter. Both sides answered to whoever had built that back door. The first man came through the service entrance, the same entrance, Amara would reflect later, that she'd clocked on her very first week, cataloging exactly which guests avoided the front gate. She met him in the hallway with a fire extinguisher and the calm, economical violence of someone who'd been trained for exactly this scenario by people who no longer existed to take credit for it. He went down before he registered she wasn't staff fleeing in panic. She didn't stop moving. 3 more came through the garden entrance. Min-jae, for the first time in 2 decades, found himself in a physical fight inside his own home, and found, to his considerable surprise, that his wife was already there ahead of him, having dismantled the second attacker's advantage before Min-jae had finished crossing the room. It lasted 4 minutes. It felt longer, the way violence always does, time stretching to accommodate the body's adrenaline rather than the clock's indifference. When it was over, Tae-sik was on the floor of the study, not killed by the intruders, but by the realization, arriving a half-second too late, that the men sent to clean the room had been instructed to leave no loose ends, and a cornered handler with knowledge of the account was the loosest end of all. He'd taken the shot meant to silence him before he could finish explaining who he'd really been protecting. Min-jae knelt beside him anyway, some old reflex toward a man he'd once trusted refusing to fully extinguish. "Who?" he said. "Tell me who." Tae-sik's last act of loyalty, to himself, or perhaps to some shred of conscience arriving 4 years too late, was a single word, barely audible: father. He didn't specify whose. He didn't get the chance. Min-jae looked up and found Amara standing over the wreckage of an ambush she dismantled with her bare hands, breathing steady, expression unreadable, exactly the way she'd later be described in the one report about that night that would ever be written down and then immediately destroyed. For the first time in his entire adult life, Kang Min-jae understood, with total clarity, what it felt like to need someone. He just didn't yet understand whose father Tae-sik had meant. Grief, Min-jae was discovering, came in stages he hadn't been warned about. First the body, Tae-sik's, removed quietly through channels that existed precisely for nights like this. Then the silence of the house afterward, thick and wrong, like a held note that wouldn't resolve. Then the word. Father. He'd assumed, in the chaos, that Tae-sik meant the organization's old guard, some retired enforcer still calling himself father the way certain men in certain professions claimed honorifics they hadn't earned. He told himself that for 2 days, because the alternative required him to reopen a grief he'd spent 6 years carefully sealing shut. Amara didn't push him toward the alternative. She didn't need to. She'd already found the ledger in his father's study, the donor record with her own father's name written in a dead man's hand. She'd been carrying that knowledge alone for over a week, weighing how much truth a man could absorb in one sitting before truth stopped being a gift and became cruelty. She decided on the third night, when Min-jae found her in the study she now visited often, the dust finally cleared from weeks of careful, deliberate cleaning. "There's something in the drive," she said. "Something I should have shown you before Tae-sik died, if I'm honest. I was protecting you from it. I'm done doing that." She laid it out the way her father had taught her, facts first, conclusions last, because conclusions delivered too early invite a listener to argue with the feeling instead of the evidence. The maritime fraud routes. The consulting donation. The timeline that placed Kang Min-jae's father in direct financial contact with the very fraud her father had been investigating, in the exact month her father's boat went down off Busan. Min-jae read it twice. Then a third time, the way a man rereads a diagnosis hoping the words will rearrange themselves into something survivable. "My father," he said slowly, "built half this empire on shipping contracts I was taught to be proud of." "Your father," Amara said, gently for the first time since she'd met him, "built half this empire by silencing a man who was 18 months from exposing the entire network." "My father didn't disappear in an accident, Min-jae. He was a liability your family paid to remove." The room held the kind of silence that follows a structural collapse, not loud, not violent, just the settling of dust over something that used to stand. "Tae-sik," Min-jae said finally, understanding arriving in pieces. "He wasn't protecting a rival's interest. He was protecting my father's legacy. Cleaning up a debt my father left unpaid, 20 years late. And when it got too close to surfacing," Amara said, "someone decided a handler with that much knowledge was more liability than asset." Min-jae sat with that, his hands flat on the desk like a man bracing against something only he could feel moving. 20 years of believing his father a ruthless but principled architect, undone by a single ledger entry his wife had found while dusting a room he hadn't entered out of grief he'd mistaken for respect. "You've known this for over a week," he said. Not accusation. Something closer to wonder, that she'd carried it without using it against him, without leveraging it the way every other person in his life leveraged everything. "I've known things like this my whole adult life," Amara said. "Carrying it quietly is the only skill that's kept me alive. This is, perhaps, the part of the story worth sitting with longest, not the betrayal itself, but the particular damage of discovering the people who raised you on a foundation of honor built that foundation over someone else's unmarked grave. How many empires, how many families, how many reputations are standing today on debts somebody simply chose never to repay? If this chapter hit a nerve, you already know the answer isn't comfortable. Say what you'd do in Min-jae's position, walk away from the inheritance, or stay and rebuild it clean. "What do you want from me?" Min-jae asked, and it wasn't a challenge. It was, for possibly the first time in his life, a genuine question with no leverage attached to it. "I want the truth finished," Amara said. "There's one file left on the drive. Encrypted past anything my father expected me to crack alone. He built it that way on purpose, I think, in case it ever fell into the wrong hands. I need access to Kang Group's original incorporation records to break the last layer. Records only a Kang can authorize." Min-jae understood, with the particular clarity of a man who'd run out of alternatives, what she was really asking. Not for help finding evidence against his enemies. For help finishing the case against his own bloodline, wherever it led, however far up the family tree the rod extended. "You're asking me to indict my own father," he said. "I'm asking you," Amara corrected, "to decide whether the empire you inherited is worth more to you than the truth of how it was built. I can't make that choice for you. I've spent 4 years running from men who made that choice wrong." Min-jae looked at his wife, the woman he'd married purely as a weapon against his rivals, who had turned out to be the only person in his life with no leverage to gain and nothing left to lose, and therefore the only one with no reason to lie to him. "Open it," he said. "All of it. Whatever's in that last file, I'd rather know than keep building on a lie." Amara nodded once, and reached for the drive. She didn't tell him, not yet, that her instinct said the last file wouldn't just indict his father. It would explain why someone in his family was still alive, still close, still watching, and still very much invested in making sure that file never opened at all. The last file took 6 hours to break, even with Kang Group's incorporation records feeding the decryption algorithm her father had built. Amara worked through the night in the study that had become, without either of them quite naming it, neutral ground between two people who'd started as strangers wearing each other's leverage like ill-fitting coats. Min-jae stayed. He told himself it was oversight, a man confirming his wife wasn't fabricating evidence against his bloodline for reasons he couldn't yet name. By hour 4, watching her work with the same unhurried precision she'd once used to fold his family's contempt into the laundry, he stopped pretending it was suspicion. It was something closer to faith, a word he hadn't used about another person since he was young enough to still believe his father deserved it. The file opened at 4:47 a.m. It wasn't evidence against his father. It was evidence from him, a confession, dated 8 months before his death, recorded not for the authorities but, Amara realized with a chill, for insurance. The old man had known something would eventually surface. He'd built his own dead man's switch, the same instinct her father had used, except aimed in the opposite direction. If you are watching this, the recording began, in Kang Min-jae's father's unmistakable voice, flattened by age and something that might have been regret, then someone has finally found what I spent 20 years trying to bury deeper than the men I buried it with. The confession was thorough in the way only guilty men's confessions are, as if confessing in detail was the closest he could come to absolution he didn't believe he deserved. The original fraud. The order to silence Elias Brantose before his investigation surfaced. And then, the detail neither Amara nor Min-jae had anticipated, the man who'd executed that order, the man who'd built the surveillance backdoor still active in the estate systems decades later, the man who'd recruited and eventually disposed of Han Tae-sik, was Min-jae's uncle. His father's younger brother. The same uncle who'd sat at every family dinner for 30 years, who'd offered Min-jae quiet condolences after his father's funeral, who'd attended the wedding and laughed loudest at the joke of marrying the maid. The same uncle who was, at that exact moment, 3 floors below them, having let himself into the estate using a key that technically still worked because no one had ever thought to ask why a retired relative still needed one. Min-jae heard the footsteps before Amara did, years of operating in a world built on the assumption that every silence was concealing something had sharpened instincts she was only beginning to understand he possessed beneath the ice. He knows the file opened, Min-jae said quietly, already moving toward the door. The system would have flagged it. He's been waiting to see if we'd find it. Or waiting to make sure you never got the chance to read it out loud to anyone else, Amara said, and for once, her calm cracked just slightly, not fear, but the particular fury of watching a man complete a cycle her father had started paying for 20 years ago. They found him in the foyer, not fleeing, not hiding, standing in the marble entryway like a man accepting an invitation rather than facing a reckoning. He'd had decades to rehearse this moment, apparently, and chose composure as his final performance. "You should have left it buried," he said to Min-jae, with the weary disappointment of an uncle scolding a nephew for poor judgment rather than a murderer cornered by his own crimes. "Your father understood the cost of looking too closely at the foundation. Some walls aren't meant to be tested. Walls don't have the decency to hold anything up," Min-jae said, quoting, without realizing it, the exact thought he'd had about himself the very first chapter of this story, except now the words landed on someone else, someone who deserved them more. "You built this one on a man's murder and called it inheritance." What happened next wasn't violence. Security arrived within minutes, summoned by Amara before they'd even reached the foyer, because she'd learned long ago that justice delivered with your own hands invites consequences justice delivered through proper channels does not. The uncle was led out in handcuffs assembled from his own family's private security force, men who'd spent decades answering to a Kang and were, for the first time, choosing which one. The empire didn't survive intact. It couldn't, not once the truth of its foundation became part of the public record, fed strategically to the one journalist Amara trusted not to bury it for a bribe. Kang Group restructured, smaller, cleaner, no longer financial leviathan but something closer to what Min-jae had always claimed to want and never actually built, an organization that didn't require a wall of fear to stand upright. 6 months later, on the anniversary of a wedding that had started as a humiliation neither of them survived unchanged, Min-jae found Amara in the garden, reading the same cracked spine paperback she'd been holding the night he finally saw her clearly. "I married you to send a message to my enemies," he said. "I married you to disappear into a job nobody respected," Amara said. "We were both lying about what we actually wanted." "And what did we actually want?" Amara closed her book, and for the first time since the morning she'd walked into his mansion in a uniform 2 sizes too sharp for the role she was playing, she let him see the smile she'd been hiding underneath the calm, not performance, not strategy. Just hers. "Someone who wouldn't underestimate us twice," she said. It was, Kang Min-jae thought, the first piece of leverage in his entire life that he had absolutely no interest in spending.